So, hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is all about making effective and compliant advertising claims in the Middle East specifically. So before I start, this webinar is being recorded and I'll be sending out the recording at the end of the webinar. There's also going to be the chance for a question and answer towards the end. So if you've got any questions as we go through, please feel free to put them in the question and answer box. You should have a little Q&A box on your screen, or share them in the chat. And also feel free to use the chat if there's anything that you want to share with the rest of the audience as well. So yes, obviously we need to think about making effective and compliant advertising claims. And I always like doing these webinars where I break down a specific territory, because there is different kind of legislation and regulations involved in different territories. So there's a compliant part, making sure we're covering that. So looking at how to find those and kind of looking at what some of those are. But then also we want to talk about making effective advertising claims. So just to kind of look at the agenda, I also like to share case studies for claim substantiation and then how those claims are then used in advertising. And that's how we're making it effective. So in terms of the compliance, we'll be looking at an overview of the MENA FMCG industry, just to give us kind of overview there. But specifically today, I will be talking a lot about the GCC and I will tell you why. But we're also going to look at other advertising standards as well. And generally sort of looking at how we make sure that we are, again, compliant in those territories and effective as well with our claims. So just to start off with, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Carys and I'm the Regulatory Director at Ayton Global Research. So we are a leading consumer research company. And as such, the studies that we conduct tend to be used for claim substantiation. So that's really what I'm looking at in particular, is advertising claims, how we make sure they are compliant and what kind of regulations are involved in that kind of compliancy there. So that's where my specialism really lies. So you can always feel free to reach out to me if you have an upcoming project, if you have some advertising claims you want to make or some product testing you want to conduct, we can look at that together and make sure that it's going to be effective and compliant. So to give us the overview, we want to look at the Middle East market. So there's a few kind of bits of market research, which I always like to put up just to give us that overview of what this market looks like. And in particular, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and the UAE together account for a quarter of the Middle East and Africa's market. And that was in 2017 and has continued to grow. Generally in the Middle East, the GCC countries are the fastest growing markets for cosmetics in particular, which I know a lot of you are going to be from the cosmetics industry. So that's why I wanted to focus on it. Although if you're not in cosmetics, don't worry, it will still be applicable to any FMCG category. But the GCC countries are the ones that have the highest per capita spending in cosmetic products. So because the Middle East is huge, let's kind of focus it down a little bit. And a lot of today we'll be talking about the GCC. And again, there's good reason for that. But they are, the kind of fastest growing industries there. Then in the GCC kind of industry and the GCC market, we've then got the e-commerce sector, which is, again, really important. Not just because of what's going on naturally, where people are shopping online more, but obviously because of the pandemic over the last couple of years, people have been spending more and more online. And that's really important when we're talking about advertising regulation and, in fact, having effective adverts, because it's kind of past those days of making sure your packaging or something like that is going to stand out on the shelves. And we really need to make sure that the adverts we're putting out online, whether it's through social media, on our website or wherever, really focusing on online advertising is going to be hugely important when you're looking at breaking into these markets. But it was an interesting one as well. I felt the fact that this was really interesting is that the e-commerce sector, again, in the GCC, was kind of really low in 2015, and it has more than quadrupled in size by 2020. So that's what kind of Kearney predicted. So yeah, it has since 2015. It's gone from 5 billion revenue to 24 billion. It's huge. So, and again, it's that huge, fast growth as well. So it's really a good place to be looking. They also had this graph that I found quite interesting, which shows kind of for how each territory within the GCC has grown within that last 5 years as well. And again, you can see that Saudi Arabia is at the top, and UAE is just following behind. Then you've got kind of Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain are kind of following on a little bit from that. But again, you can see that Saudi Arabia and UAE are our huge markets again within the GCC. So I keep talking about the GCC. I'm sure most of you know what I'm talking about, but let's just take it a step back and go, right, what countries are we looking at in particular? It's the Gulf Cooperation Council. So basically, it's a unity from these countries that have similar political and cultural identities, which are rooted in Arab and Islamic culture. And that's the UAE, the Kingdom of Bahrain, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait. And that's the kind of GCC countries we're looking at. And as I said, that's really where we'll focus today. A lot of what I talk about will be applicable across the whole of the Middle East. But in terms of having different regulations and legislation, we'll be looking at the GCC in particular, because we know this is a huge market in particular. It's also, they are huge markets, especially Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. We know are huge luxury FMCG categories as well in terms of revenue there. So it really is, if you're looking at having a high price point for your products, they are great markets to be looking at. So that's why I've focused on it today. But generally, this Cooperation Council, it is about trade as well as kind of just cultural beliefs and everything like that. It's really giving a huge advantage for trade. There's lots of trade deals within these countries. So again, if you're trying to access one of these markets, it does open you up to the whole of the GCC. And that's why we want to focus on it and make sure, if we are looking at the whole of the GCC, making sure we're doing it correctly. So when we're talking about advertising compliance, the best place to start is always about how are adverts regulated. So generally, ad self-regulation across the globe is how adverts are regulated. It makes sure that adverts are legal, decent, honest, and truthful. So making sure that we're being fair to our competitors, as well as fair to our consumers with the adverts we're putting out there. It's generally dealt with on a complaints basis. So when we're saying self-regulation, it basically means that we're not kind of having someone review every single advert we put out there, because obviously there's millions of adverts, so it could get ridiculous. And it's really up to you as an advertiser or as a brand or whoever is responsible for putting that advert out there, that you know what the code of conduct is for the self-regulatory organization in the country that you're selling the product. And it makes sure that, again, that you're kind of regulating yourself and that it's a fair playing field. So it works on a complaints basis. If you've got an advert out there, it could be on your social media, could be online, could be on your pack copy. If you've got a certain kind of claims, advertising claims on your product and your advert, it's up to your competitors or your consumers to complain about that advert if they don't think it is true or it's misleading or it's unfair. And that's really what you're looking at. So it's important to know, because people kind of go, oh, well, you know, consumers are less likely to complain because, we know it'll work. You're more likely to have competitors complain, to be honest, because they'll see the kind of adverts you're putting out there. And if they've had issues or if they've had kind of spent a lot of money getting those claims substantiated and they don't believe you have, that's really who you've got to be more aware of. So essentially, if your adverts are complained about, you'll be asked to correct it or remove the advert. Of course, that's quite easy if it's on your social media. If it's online, you can kind of remove it. But obviously, if it's on your pack copy, it could be a whole product recall. Now, every self-regulatory organization is slightly different. There are different punishments. Certainly in GCC territories, okay, as opposed to the UK, for example, where you get asked to remove the advert and then it's kind of fine, you go straight in with a fine in the GCC countries. So if you've got a misleading advert and it gets complained about and you're found to be misleading or not having evidence behind your claims, there are quite hefty fines off the bat. So we'll look at those today. And I think the reason I bring it up is it is one of the most important territories if you've got advertising claims, to make sure that you have got evidence behind them, that they're true, because it can be really quite expensive if you get caught out. So let's talk about who the organizations are. Now in the GCC, you have the Advertising Self-Regulated Organization, the Advertising Business Group, the ABG, and they are representing all of the GCC countries. So again, really helpful to know, because if you're advertising across, you know you can just follow the code of conduct for the ABG and you're going to be compliant in those territories, which is fantastic. So what are the ABGs kind of, what do they really put forward? They want to drive awareness of the ICC code, which is the International Chamber of Commerce. And as you can see, the ICC code, general kind of basic principle is the content of advertising will be decent, honest, and truthful, with a due sense of self-responsibility and respect for the rules of fair competition. Again, we'll talk a little bit about what that can look like kind of later on. But that's really important to kind of always have in your head. This is the kind of code that the ABG are really pushing forward. So they want to drive awareness of that to establish and advocate good advertising. But they're also, of course, a platform for handling issues. So as I said, any complaints, that will go through the ABG. And they also provide a lot of advice on best practices. So they've got a guide as well on their website. So they're really helpful if you want to do advertising in the GCC and you want to make sure you're compliant. The ABG are basically your go-to organization to make sure that you're being compliant there. Then more specifically, so we've got the ABG, which cover all of GCC, but it's really important to make sure that you're also looking at each country specifically. And for example, in the UAE, you'd have the National Media Council, the NMC, which is a federal government body. So where the ABG are self-regulatory, so making sure they've got the code there and it's your responsibility, the NMC actually are federal. So it really is law at this point, and it's making sure that you are really abiding by the rules there, because it can be much harsher. As I mentioned, this is where we're looking at things like fines. So they formulate the media legislations, they look at the implementation, and they also review advertisers, making sure they're following them. And as I said, you get fined if you don't comply with the rules. Can't remember off the top of my head what it is, but it's quite a hefty first fine. And then if you're a repeat offender, it keeps coming up again. And you also have a very limited amount of time to be able to provide that evidence. So it's one of those territories, again, that you need to make sure you're going in there with compliant adverts and that you're not trying to kind of fix any mistakes. They've got the advertising guide as well, which is, again, a really helpful resource. They're not trying to trick you out. Whenever I'm talking about these kind of companies, it's very, very clear how to make a compliant advert, and they give you loads and loads of information. It's just going in with that knowledge to make sure you're confident that your adverts are compliant. So of course that goes across the whole of the GCC, goes across the whole of the Middle East. Each country is going to have its own legislation, its own regulations, but I would be here all day if I was to break down every country. So this is an example for now. Start with the ABG, then look at each country that you're looking at selling in particular, and see what the organizations are that are regulating the adverts there. But generally, I mean, again, I'm not trying to kind of scare everyone. If you're following the code of conduct of the ABG, it's very likely it's applicable across all countries, but it just always looks specifically as well. So now we talked about the compliance, we want to really think about what an advertising claim is and how we can make them effective as well as compliant as well. So just to make sure we're on the same page, when I talk about what an advertising claim is, I just want to kind of break that down and make sure that we're all on the same page there. So a claim is anything that's used to market a product across any platform. So as I mentioned before, website, social media, TV, paid copy. It basically should describe the effects of the product and the benefits, so people can know how to choose it. So, if it's a lengthening mascara, that's a claim, but people know if they want to have longer lashes, that's what they're going to go for. It's really to help those consumers. But it should also make your product stand out in a crowded market. So as well as just having lengthening mascara, because there's a million lengthening mascaras on the market, what else can you say about it that's going to really make it stand out? It could be dramatic length. It could be 90% of consumers believe that this is the longest their lashes have ever looked. These are the things that we're then trying to kind of up our game when we've got those effects on there. Our advertising claims should then go above what's in the crowded market. And they should make you look better than the competition. So as I said, it's kind of taking it to another level. and not just describing the benefits, but going, how can we stand out across all of our competition and make sure that the consumers choose our product? And you can see there's some examples around the screen here of what that might look like. So when we're then talking about compliance, we need to make sure if we're going to say these things that we have some kind of evidence behind our claims, because otherwise there's no point in saying it. It's not going to be true. It's not going to be honest, and it's not going to go with all of those important things that we've talked about. So how do we substantiate a claim? Well, there's kind of two main methods. There's clinical and consumer research. When you're looking at clinical research, we've got what we call in vivo, ex vivo, and in vitro. So in vivo is on a human, ex vivo is on human cells or something like that. Oh God, I don't know why I'm trying to make scientific words. I'm terrible at them. But it's on a human sort of cell off of the humans. It could be hair strands. And then in vitro is something that replicates something human, but it's not. And testing on them, again, in a kind of like petri dish sense. So in vivo is the one that I'll talk about in a bit more depth, because that's what you're really tending to look at when you're looking at claim substantiation. So it's basically, looking at creating an instrumental or biochemical technique on that person. So for example, it could be looking at wrinkle depth. So you would obviously want to analyze how deep the wrinkles are, then apply the product and then look at it after. And you need some instruments to be able to do that and measure how that wrinkle depth has changed. It's basically giving you objective data, which can be used to support the performance and ingredient claims. So there's lots of standard techniques. It's not something that's kind of like you make something up every time. There tends to be, like I said, if you're looking at wrinkle depth or hydration, there's sort of standard techniques that exist that are kind of recognized about the industry to be used there. It's really important that it's blinded as well. So either double blinded, where the person who's testing it doesn't know what it is, or the person that's applying it, or just kind of one side blinded, where the person testing it doesn't know where it is. And it's removing bias. Now that's an important thing I wanted to bring up, because that is important in claim substantiation, whether it's on clinical or consumer research. So what's consumer research? Well, where we're talking about clinical, being someone evaluating it through an instrument or through a certain technique, consumer research is asking the consumer to evaluate it. So what do they think? What's their perception of the product and what's their opinion? And that's where I was saying earlier, something like 90% of people agree that their lashes were dramatically lengthened. That's what we're looking at there. So generally it's in-home user studies that are being used. So we're sending out products for people to test in their own home, and then they'll answer an online questionnaire based on those opinions there. The important thing here is it's reflecting the actual conditions of the product in use. So where, as I said, you could look at the wrinkles and go, right, we're applying this amount of moisturizer to them and then analyzing it afterwards. When you're looking at a consumer test, you're saying to the consumer, use this product as you usually would. Do you think your wrinkles are less noticeable? And kind of going on it that way. It's really important to have that, because obviously when people purchase your product, they're not going to be having someone apply it and kind of looking at it detailed, analyzed. They're going to be using it off their own opinion. So they can also look at comparing products. So that's an important thing to consider as well with claims. If you want to say you're better than someone, it's really important to make sure you have some evidence behind it there. It's also important to note you may need additional evidence for certain claims. Now, when we're looking at consumer research and providing this for our clients, what we tend to do is ask for, what are the claims you want to say about the product? And we'll either say we can word it a certain way to have consumer research evidence, or we might say, okay, you've got 10 claims you really want to make here. 9 of them we can do through consumer research, and this one is going to need a bit of extra objective evidence from an instrumental study, and that's what we'll provide for that one. So it's important to think about what actually needs to be in there as well, and again, that's what we can really help with in terms of that body of evidence. But what's the advantages of that consumer research? Well, it's a faster response to time and it's a cheaper cost, essentially. It's more reasonable because, again, for every clinical claim, you might have an instrumental study for every single one. Whereas for a consumer study, a consumer can evaluate several claims in one test. And again, you might want to just pick up one for the clinical. Again, we said it's reflecting the actual conditions of use. You can target a wider range of consumers. So for example, it could be that you want to look at every GCC country. So we're running consumer tests in every single one, very easy to do because we're just sending them to test at home. Whereas for a clinical study, they'd have to each go into a lab. So it becomes very tricky to do that. Or it could be that you want to look at different demographics as well. And again, so that multi-country and language use there, it also allows you to gather other marketing materials, things like testimonials, photos, videos, all very easily on lots of different target consumers. So with that in mind, let's look at how we actually put this into practice. So we've got in mind how our adverts are regulated. We know we need to have some evidence behind our claims to be able to say them in our advertising. Now, how do we substantiate those claims? So I've picked up a case study of a study that we've run from a global award-winning beauty brand, and they wanted to test their clay mask in the UAE. So they wanted to meet up with the advertising standards, of course, and in particular substantiate the claims that the skin is softer, smoother, and that imperfections are improved. So that's our kind of key claims there that we want to evaluate. So what was the panel criteria? So they all were female because that was their target consumer, with a lovely wide age range, 25 to 70 years old, because it doesn't matter what age they are, we can still assess those claims. And they wanted to make sure they had a wide target consumer. We had all skin types, including sensitive, because again, they want to reflect lots of different skin types there. Regular face mask users was important because they needed to, kind of use it and assess it compared to other face masks they've used. They had to have display skin imperfections and blemishes, because again, we want to assess that they are improved. And they had to have skin redness as well, because that was another thing they wanted to assess there. So what were the test conditions? So they had to use the product 2 to 3 times a week for the 2-week study. They had the usage directions again to reflect what would be the usage instructions when they purchased the product. So we want to reflect those actual conditions in use. And again, we've got things like our safety instructions and our application area to make sure everyone's using it correctly and that it's really representing what they're going to see on the market. So we've sent out our product to everyone. They've tested it for those 2 weeks, and then they've answered an online questionnaire, providing us with a lovely report, which clearly shows us what kind of claims we can make about our product. So this has come from our reports, the summary of the report at the end, after we've gone through the statistical analysis. And we're basically looking at here each kind of question that we've asked, or each claim, the number of people that have had a satisfied or not satisfied response, and really importantly, the percentage of people. Why is it really important about the percent? Well, for a start, we need to make sure that the majority of people have agreed with the claim, because otherwise it's not going to pass. You can't say it at all. And then we also want the percentage because it's what we're going to lift out and put into our advertising. So for example, we can say 92% of people agreed that their skin felt soft following just one application of the mask. 93% agreed that the skin appears smoother. 85% agreed the appearance of imperfections was improved. And 85% agree that this appearance of blemishes is improved as well. So again, we've managed to get those claims they needed, and now they can lift that straight into their advertising. So what does that look like? First, I just want to go through the legislation. So again, like I said, we have all these different codes. The ABG code, what is really specific about this research? All advertising claims and representations must be able to be supported by competent, independent, and reliable evidence. Very important that it's independent as well, so you're not conducting it in-house, and that it's reliable. So this is all of this, kind of statistical analysis, making sure that we've really assessed it. So how do we then use those advertising claims? So a few good examples here that are out in the world being used in the market. So Temple Spa are good at kind of combining the use of their percentage claims with testimonials. So things like 84% of people agreed that the moisturizer provided them with a healthy looking radiant glow. And then you've got a testimonial above it to say it gave my skin a lovely radiant glow that made me feel confident to go makeup free. And again, 95% said the moisturizer leaves their skin feeling hydrated. It worked amazingly well on my combination skin, and it was left feeling soft, smooth, hydrated, and balanced. So a lovely way of combining all this different data as well. And again, what does that look like on social media? They've managed to do some really amazing visuals on their Instagram and their Facebook that again capture those results and really show it off in their advertising. A couple of other examples as well. We've got Elemis with their cleanser, saying 91% of people agreed that this frothy, soothing cleanser left their skin feeling cleansed, purified, and refreshed. And Origins as well, with their 97% felt smoother, softer skin. And it's just, as you can see, it's very effective in their advertising, but they've also clearly got evidence behind those claims as well. So we're making sure that we're compliant. So in terms of what not to do, and then I'm going to just quickly summarize today's webinar so we can have some question and answers. This is kind of the scare side of what it looks like in the Middle East. So the Advertising Business Group have really taken on a huge part. This is the few years ago, just to show that 5 years ago they were really starting to kind of bump up their advertising regulations here. So they're really taking on misleading ads in the UAE. And they've now got a huge amount of members that span across all the greatest biggest corporations to really crack down on this and make sure they're making it fair. So that's why it's really important, because over the last 5 years, it really has bumped up. And again, that really reflects in their e-commerce as well. As e-commerce has grown, it's really important to make sure that regulation is being shown as well. So this is what I was saying about the fines for advertising as well. So here we go with violating advertising rules in UAE could get you a 5,000 fine. So it's usually so that's kind of the first fine, and then they increase that over time as well. So in this one, you can see that posting false ads online could land you a hefty fine. It's getting so tongue twisted today. Could land you a hefty fine of 200,000 Arab Emirate dollars. So it's really important to make sure you're not making these mistakes, and that you are following these regulations as well. So just to summarize, and I'll go to a Q&A. So it's essential to use advertising claims to stand out against your competition. If you looked at today and gone, oh gosh, there's so much I have to do to make sure I can say these things, I don't want to make any advertising claims. Well, it's really silly not to, because all of your competitors are. So you need to make sure that your product is going to stand out. And by doing that, you need to have some amazing advertising claims. You always need to make sure your data is compliant in the country you're selling in. Look at those different countries' regulations, or make sure that you check in with someone like us if you're unsure. It's really important to gain product feedback as well from the consumers in your key markets. So if you're completely global and you're like, well, I have claim substantiation evidence from the UK, I'm going to use that in the UAE. Well, it's not really a fair kind of representation of those consumers. So therefore, it's not really compliant, because you're not saying, in that different temperature, on those different skin types, and actually in terms of those different opinions, you're not really taking that on board. And it's also make sure that you have a better success. If you've tested in those countries, you'll be more successful, because you'll have really got that feedback from the people you want to sell your product to. Advertising regulations always change, so stay informed in your markets. There are newsletters you can sign up to with people like the ABG to make sure that you're on top of that. Always clearly display your evidence in your advertising to avoid scrutiny. So as I said, if you've really clearly got your percentages and the number of people that have tested it in your advertising, it really just puts you ahead to make sure that you aren't going to get kind of scrutinized, and that you can be very clear and very honest, say, I have this evidence, and this is how amazing my product is, and really show it off. So any questions? I can see something in the chat. I'm not sure if I've got a question in already, but let's have a little look. So we have got a question from Kenda. So does this data need to be produced in the Middle East, or can this research be done anywhere as long as it's documented? So again, that's kind of what I've mentioned there. Now, there are different rules. It really does depend on the claim. For things like clinical evidence, it does not matter as much, I would say, because it's something that's instrumental study in a lab, and it's kind of in a controlled environment and everything like that. It's something that I would recommend maybe getting tested in a few of your key markets, but maybe not as importantly. But I think when it comes to consumer research in particular, again, some countries might let you get away with it, because obviously, you've got some evidence there already. But I always think I don't want to try and get away with my advertising. I want to make sure I've got the best opportunity possible. A really good example here, though, is we conducted a study before with a client who had a long-lasting foundation. Their claims were substantiated in the UK, all long-lasting and everything like that. Then they went to sell in Malaysia, and they found the data wasn't compliant, because obviously in Malaysia they have more oily skin types, they have a more humid climate. It wasn't as long lasting, because it wasn't built for that kind of that climate and that skin type. So it's really important to get that feedback, and if you want to formulate a long lasting foundation that you can sell globally, get it tested there, find out, does it work, does it do what you want it to do? So yes, there is one of those things that I would say it's probably it's not a set rule for every single claim, it's not a set rule for every single territory. And if you're unsure and you're in lots of different markets, please do feel free to reach out, because that's something I specialize in, is to go, right, these are the claims you're making, this is the type of product you're making, and this is where you're advertising it. Yes, that data is compliant, or no, I would get some extra data for it. But again, it's a really important part of that new product development anyway, to get that feedback from the consumers that are going to be using your product. So I hope that has answered your question, probably waffled on a bit there. Any further questions coming in today? I can't see anything in yet. But as always, I will follow up with my email address. So please do feel free, and the recording the webinar, of course. So please do feel free to send over any other questions or any projects you want to discuss afterwards. So just to round up, we've got the IFSCC next year, which we're very proud to be sponsoring. So please do join us there. And that's going to be in September 2022. So just under a year away now. So please register your interest. I've got a couple of upcoming webinars. So on the 15th of October, I can't believe we're in October today. This year's flown by. We're talking about making advertising claims of the new wave of climate change formulation. So that's a rerun of the presentation I gave in cosmetics last year. We'll also be looking on the 29th of October, compliant and effective advertising in Southeast Asia. So similar to today, but we'll be looking at Southeast Asia in particular, which might be, a really good example. We talked about Malaysia there as well. So there's my contact information, but I'll be following up with an email, as I mentioned. So for now, thank you very much for joining me today. And I hope you all have a fantastic weekend.